Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for being here. We are absolutely delighted to have this amazing panel. It says on. Okay. This amazing panel this morning. We are honored to have Secretary General Luis Almagro, Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, who has really done an amazing job in upholding democratic and human rights standards for the region. Additionally, we have very dear friends here, Ned's very dear friends, Chris Sabatini, who was my predecessor in this position and who runs Global Americans and is producing these very relevant reports, and Katia Salazar, who has been a longtime partner and a strong strong activist and defender of human rights and democracy in the region, and especially now exercising her leadership at DPLF, Due Process of Law Foundation, extremely relevant organization based in DC, but with wide ramifications throughout the region. So without no more delay, I would like to ask Secretary General Almagro to join us for the session. He will do the keynote presentation. After that, Chris will present the report and Katia will offer comments. Thank you. Depende del tiempo.
Democracy and human rights are under strain in some parts of the hemisphere, but the OAS has unique instruments and tools to ensure the eventual triumph over inequality, social exclusion, corruption, the erosion of political rights, and the closure of civic space. Dear friends, I want to thank Christopher Sabatini of Global Americans and our host here at the National Endowment for Democracy for the opportunity to address you this morning. The Latin America we recognize today is radically different from only a few decades ago, when authoritarian or military regimes were the norm. Today, democracy is the most common form of government in the Americas. We have built a hemisphere on a foundation of the shared values we believe in, a vision of inclusiveness, democracy, human rights, and universal freedoms. These principles, the very core of the OAS, are clearly articulated in our founding documents: the OAS Charter, the American Charter of Human Rights, the Inter-American Conventions, and the Inter-American Democratic Charter. The promise and opportunity of the hemisphere lie in these shared values of more democracy, rights, security, and prosperity for all. This is why I have made the theme of more rights for more people the centerpiece of my administration. The OAS is a forum created by and for member states to come together in a meaningful dialogue to achieve the fulfillment of these shared visions for the Americas. We are meeting today in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, and where the headquarters of the OAS calls home. In 1889, at the invitation of the government of the United States, we began the process we recognize as the Inter-American System, a process that continues interrupted to this day. The first International Conference of American States was held to discuss and recommend for adoption to their respective governments some plan of arbitration for the settlements of disagreements and disputes that may hereafter arise between them, and for considering questions relating to the intercourse and means of direct communications between said countries. 18 American states took part, and since then the forum has grown to include all 35 states in the Americas, looking at issues from interstate relations to commercial issues, to border disputes, to collective security. Today, these are organized under the 4 pillars of the OAS: democracy, human rights, integral development, and multidimensional security. The purpose of this institution is to guide and facilitate the relationship between countries in our hemisphere. We are as strong as our strongest member and as weak as our weakest link. The United States played an integral role by bringing us all together. This is the only regional institution that includes all 35 states in the Americas. Each member state plays an essential role in making this relationship work, and just as interstate relations have their strengths and weaknesses, so does this institution. This hemisphere remains one of the most unequal in the world, and its citizens are tired of exclusion, wary of racism, persecution, and sterile conflicts we drag on needlessly. Over the years, we have collectively identified and negotiated these values, created agreements that guide these institutions and our interactions with one another. Each member state chooses to negotiate and sign onto these principles, defining who we are, what we believe, and how we interact with each other. As member states and as citizens, we have a responsibility to ensure that these rights are protected. Our member states are each unique, be it size, populations, demographics, wealth, or influence. For some, an individual state's actions can affect the entire continent. We build this institution to help close these divides and find common interest where we can work together. Multilateral institutions make collective efforts feasible. Collective action offers legitimacy where the efforts of an individual country may come up short. In turn, governments are more likely to participate if there is an institutional framework or collective interest over an individual task. Individual member states determine how well this institution works. If member states want a strong OES and a strong relationship between American states, they will create one. If they want to isolate themselves and focus on unilateral interest, no longer cooperating with one another, they will do so. We are at an interesting moment in modern history. There appears to be a growing appetite for populist politics in some of the most developed economies around the world. We must resist a shift toward isolationism, where communities retreat into what and who they know, and instead renew our commitments to pluralism, openness, and inclusivity. This also holds true about the states of democracy. Across the hemisphere, countries use a diverse set of demographic systems at different stages of political maturity and consolidation. Democracy is a process, not an end. There is no single solution that will work for everyone. Today, democracies are stronger, offering better social protections with more integrated economies. However, we cannot take this for granted. Citizens have a responsibility as much as a right. It is more than an election. It is what comes after. Democracy is freedom of expression, association, and assembly. It is a transparent and accountable government that serves the people. It is an empowered citizen, a strong civil society, a vocal, engaged opposition, a vibrant, independent media, an independent judiciary, and a security apparatus that is trusted by and accountable to the people. Most importantly, it requires a tolerance of dissent. We cannot become complacent because there are real and present risks in many countries across the region. With growing demands from citizens throughout the hemisphere, the principal threats and challenges are a result of weak government institutions and poor social services. Weak rule of law and growing insecurity, inequality, and social exclusion, political polarization, corruption, the erosion of political and human rights, weak political parties, and the closure of civic space all undermine democratic consolidation. Corruption has proven to be a central challenge to success of the region growth and stability because it not only affects citizens economically, but determines the public trust in the government elected to serve them. Across America, Political corruption has mobilized citizens to take to the streets to demand transparency and accountability and end impunity. Political campaigns have been fought and won over it. In Honduras, the bold and ambitious missions to support the fight against corruption and impunity in the MAXI was established to respond to the people's protest and indignation over corruption. We must continue to fight every day against corruption to address the enormous inequalities our citizens face and ensure more rights. Fundamental freedoms, human rights, and democracy do not only exist when it's convenient. They must exist always. You have to care as much as about your opponent's right to express their view as you do about your own. This is why one of the most important roles that the OAS plays in the hemisphere is facilitation, dialogue for the prevention, management, and resolution of crisis and conflict. This is why we can also offer a voice to those who have excluded the democratic process in their country. Dialogue is not simply about words. For dialogue to be effective, it must also be accompanied by action with results that come in a reasonable time frame. A lack of dialogue is the first sign of failure in a political system, because dialogue cannot exist when voices are not heard, when voices have been silenced. In Venezuela, we witness a process of dialogue, but that didn't serve to help democracy in the short term and to strengthen institutions. The opposition in Venezuela has galvanized the citizenry behind a constitutional solution to the political crisis through the recall referendum. That constitutional solution was not achieved. The international community had used the Inter-American Democratic Charter and the Democratic Clause in Mercosur to help pressure the regime to find a democratic solution. With this momentum, there was started a new phase of dialogue, and that phase of dialogue moved backwards about the powers of the National Assembly, lost even more powers through decision of the Supreme Court. The total amount of political prisoners grown, inflation continued to grow at unprecedented levels, GDP free fall, and the last opportunity for a constitutional solution, the recall referendum, has passed. The corruption cases of PDVSA and drug trials of the President Nephews are only further indicators of the country's complete institutional collapse. The insincere dialogue process has failed, instead only serving to perpetuate the conditions. The ethical and moral values that we define in the Inter-American Democratic Charter, the OAS Charter of the Inter-American Convention of Human Rights, means nothing if we do not make them a daily reality for the people of the Americas. When there are violations, we have an obligation to address them. Words are not enough. We must be prepared to act, especially when it is difficult to do so. Jose Antonio Marina says that the reason our societies fail is because we develop unjust societies. When we lose these values, we all lose, society loses. This is why I took the job of Secretary General. It is my responsibility to work and protect these values at the core of this institution and at the very heart of the Americas. We can achieve more rights for more people, and I take this responsibility to heart. The OAS, this community of states, is vital to ensuring the fullest possible observance of human rights in the hemisphere, and an essential instrument for safeguarding democracy. We have created an institutions with the mechanisms and tools to champion and defend these rights and values. Now, member states must choose to enforce them. Thank you.
Secretary General Magro, I think this your presentation sets the tone in a superb fashion. It allows us to discuss the main, excuse me, the main findings of the Global Americans report, which basically tries to track to what extent the countries in the region, the governments in the region uphold to the standards that you have just laid out in such a clear and concise and eloquent fashion. So with this background, I think you can do an excellent job in presenting your
Thanks.
report.
So I'll just stay here and start more of a conversation. First of all, it's an honor to follow the Secretary General, a man who's just incredibly principled. I think who's taken the job, understands it, understands the importance of and the principles of the body that he directs in ways that several predecessors, one in particular, did not. And has really, I think, stands strong and firm and committed to democracy and human rights. And I say that with a great deal of admiration for your work, Secretary General, and even as a foreign minister as well in Uruguay. I think very great government that you served under. So it's an honor to be here. It's also an honor to be here in the National Endowment for Democracy, where I worked myself for a few years. And it's good to see old friends, current friends, here. Let me explain a little bit why we undertook this project. When we started it, I had a working hypothesis that despite public declarations in favor of democracy, a number of Latin American governments in their foreign policies were not supporting human rights and democracy. They may talk a mean game, but in different international fora, whether in the United Nations or in the Organization of American States, they simply were failing to uphold their commitments. And the basic principle is democracy doesn't stop at your borders. And that because of that, with the rise of the global south, with the discussion of the BRICS and the rise of Russia and China and India and South Africa, what we saw was an erosion of the liberal democratic order. And so we wanted to test that. And we want to do this for two reasons. The first of all is to begin to demonstrate that and try to hold governments more accountable for their actions and their foreign policies. The second reason is we also thought that this could be a tool for US government and for other governments. The Obama administration did not do a good job of, if you will, rewarding those liberal countries that voted in favor of these norms. The fact that we now have on the UN Human Rights Commission basically controlled by the ELBA countries is a shame. There are countries that have adhered to liberal norms that need to be called out. Of course, our designate for the, now UN ambassador Nikki Haley, said that she was going to take names and numbers. That's fair enough. What I hope that means is also she's taking the names and numbers of the countries that uphold liberal values and rewards them in ways that we can sort of rebolster these institutions. So what did we find? What we did was we look at the UN Human Rights Commission. We look at how countries are voting in key human rights issues from Latin America, but also we compare those votes to Russia, India, China, South Africa. We look at the UN Human Rights Commission and what's called the Universal Periodic Review, how active they were in calling out, if you will, human rights abuses and supporting those and reacting to them. We looked at the votes of these countries or the actions of these countries in the Organization of American States, most recently in the June 23rd discussion of whether to hear or discuss Secretary General Almagro's report on Venezuela under the Inter-American Charter. We also looked at the work and the evolution of this work on election observation, what is happening, the two most recent election observations that the OAS monitored. And then we also compare the election observation standards of UNASUR and the Union of South American Republics with the OAS. What do we find? Well, first of all, not surprisingly, there are, in our first, this is our first report, second report. Our first report was titled Liberals, Rogues, and Enablers, which is probably a bad name for a superhero group. But the idea was that there are consistent countries that vote along liberal principles. There are consistent countries that vote against them. And there are ones that enable that to happen. The liberals, well, no surprise, Chile, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Uruguay, Peru, consistently voted to uphold in the UN liberal democratic notions, condemning flagrant human rights abusers like North Korea or Syria, the actions of Russia and Ukraine, and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. They also voted to uphold those. What we also found were other countries that upheld them internationally, Argentina being one of them, Mexico being another, but didn't comply with them domestically. We see, obviously, Argentina's effort under the previous government to gut the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, the effort by Mexico to basically thumb its nose at the Inter-American Commission's own visiting delegation over the Iguala massacre, and then its attacks on human rights. So you get a double standard there. But then you also get, you of course, also get the rogues, countries that consistently vote against any human rights condemnation, even in the cases of North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, among those. But then you get the curious, I would say, the enablers, the Brazils, at times even Colombia, that quietly abstain or vote against. Even in cases like Syria, what we see is that Brazil, under the PT government, was much more committed to its allies, voting with its allies, Turkey, India, China, Russia, than it was in upholding the standards that actually its own citizens enjoy, even refusing to vote against Russia in the annexation of Crimea and its treatment of Ukrainians in the war. And that's a curious mix. I think and so the point there was to try to bring this out. We also saw in the Universal Periodic Review process, Colombia was very shy, let's say, probably for reasons of its own peace talks, refused to call out human rights abuses in countries like Cuba or Venezuela, refused to do the same in other countries of Russia. And so a country that tries to hold itself up as a bastion of liberal democratic values also failed to uphold those commitments internationally consistently. What we also discovered I'll talk briefly about the Inter-American system. Whoops, this thing is way too light. What we also discovered was in the Inter-American system of human rights, some countries consistently refuse to participate or collaborate, even to the point that, of course, the Dominican Republic has pulled out or claimed that it's not under the authority of the Inter-American System of Human Rights. Venezuela is pulled out of the court. Mexico has tried to thwart it. Ecuador tried to undermine it, with Brazil being sort of a silent partner in that process. But we also see countries that are consistently supportive of the Inter-American System of Human Rights, even to the point that a number of them stepped up, most recently when the Inter-American System of Human Rights was at risk of basically going bankrupt, in ways that I think are very positive. But the point being also in that case is we see a fragmentation of the Inter-American system and its authority in the hemisphere, which I think is deeply troubling. What we do also in this issue is the latest version, Latin American the Liberal World Order, is we talk about the processes of election monitoring. And we do two things. First of all, we compare UNISOR's standards to the standards of the OAS. And UNISOR claims that it is a new option for monitoring elections. But if you look deeply at its protocols for monitoring those elections across the board, what you find is it's severely lacking in its commitment to defend citizens' rights to an electoral process. It openly declares itself there as an accompanying actor in the electoral process to work with the Electoral Commission, and it openly says that it is simply there to avoid any sort of conflict. OAS has a serious a long list of protocols that it's there that stretch back decades, and we've seen the evolution. But what has happened in the OAS are two things. And the first is, in the most recent elections in Peru and the Dominican Republic, there were restrictions placed on election observation and restrictions placed on the publication of pre-election reports that wouldn't have happened, say, 10 years ago. That really, again, demonstrate that this fraying of this consensus around liberal norms and this institutional commitment and ability to throw their weight around principles simply has been diminished. But a second thing has happened with the OAS. Despite the values of its protocols, what has happened is, and this is by its very charter, election observation missions can only be invited by the executive. What that means is in countries like Venezuela or Ecuador, a fundamental citizen's right is contingent on the institution or the branch of government that has the most interest in stealing elections. And so what that means is the National Assembly in Venezuela, despite being controlled by the opposition, cannot call for election observation missions. The governors for the local election cannot call for election observation missions. And this is a fundamental flaw in the design of the OAS that I think needs to be addressed. It basically has vested a fundamental right in an institution or a branch of government that itself is. And what do those countries do? Well, they Those executives then don't invite the OAS, they invite the far more pliant, far more subjective UNASUR, as we saw in Nicaragua, as we see in Venezuela. I'll just end one last note on this. As we looked at, thanks to the work of the World Movement for Democracy and the Carnegie Endowment, at the restrictions that are being placed on civil society in the region. And again, I hate to sound like I sort of pine for the 1990s, which is when I sort of grew up, and I do still like grunge music. But basically, that those days were when there was an open acceptance of civil society and its ability to operate. What we see is a growing set of restrictions that actually mirror very similar restrictions that are being placed in places like Russia, China, even India, that are, I think, really fly in the face of the shared principles that we all have, and that even cut across, again, countries that you wouldn't expect. One of the most restrictive places for NGOs is Colombia. Part of this obviously stems from the country's long-standing civil war. But these also need to be raised and need to be alerted. So I'll just conclude with this. What do we do with this? I mean, obviously, I like to say if you produce a report and nothing is done with it, it's like the old fake philosophical arguments, like a tree falling in the woods, and if no one's there to hear it, it doesn't make a sound. What I'd like to see we now are developing country profiles that are available online. We've spoken to people on the Hill. What we'd like to see this used as a tool for diplomatic engagement with countries to say, please explain to us why, for example, you, Brazil, abstained on a vote on Syria. How do you explain that? But second is using it more positively to reward. And in the OAS vote, the Permanent Council vote on June 23rd, on whether to hear the vote, there were some countries that very courageously stood up and voted in favor of hearing that report. Countries that people thought had written off for a long time as being part of Petrocaribe that would never vote against Venezuela and did. I think they need to be rewarded. They need to be called out and recognized for their support for democracy, because it isn't just chastising people, it's also rewarding those who call them out. And the last thing is we're working with human rights groups across the region to try to devote more attention to the foreign policies of their governments as a recognition that basically, again, commitment to human rights and democracy doesn't just stop at the borders. It also is how governments pursue their own foreign policies. With that, I'll let Katya and Miriam comment on the report. Any comments they have?
Thank you very much, Chris. I think your presentation follows up perfectly with what the Secretary General mentioned, that the countries in the region, despite being in the same framework and sharing the same principles, can behave very differently. And depending on their governments, their societies, their civil societies, they may respond in different ways to similar challenges. I think you have presented a very nuanced and complex landscape in the region, whereby countries not necessarily are coherent, consistent, and on the other hand, we also see changes in the region depending on domestic changes and also opportunities that regional bodies such as the OAS and at some certain times the UNASUR may, or basically Mercosur may offer. So I thank you very much for allowing us to see this very complex picture. And to complete this very interesting panorama of the region, we'll have the voice of civil society and civil society's interaction with the system and the civil society's efforts to try to make governments uphold these standards. So, Katya, thank you.
First of all, thank you, Chris, and thank you, Latin American Goals Global, for this important review. I think it provides us a lot of evidence that confirms or contrasts our own information about the way Latin American countries function, works in different international fora. It is on?
Yeah,
okay.
now it is.
Yeah, sorry. Well, actually, I think there is little information about this topic, especially condensed and compared in the way you have done in this report. I think it is very common to hear about Venezuela, Cuba, Mexico, or Brazil, how they think, what their opinions are in international fora, but it is not very common to learn how other Latin American countries vote or think in international fora. And there is no doubt this kind of information or analysis is priceless because it allows us to see the big picture and have a better understanding of what is behind many decisions apparently based just in principles. But from a civil society perspective, this information also gives us an additional tool for advocacy. Used creatively, we can raise the political costs of a wrong decision when we identify that a state holds different positions depending on the political fora. I will give some examples later. I know I have just 10 minutes, so I will focus just on 8 minutes. I will focus on 3 topics. The first is the role of particular states in international fora. The second one is the support to the inter-American human rights system. And the third one is what's coming, what could be the changes, or what changes we will see in this new political context in the region. About the first one, I want to address Mexico. You mentioned Mexico in different parts of your report. I agree with the report in seeing Mexico as somehow our human rights champion in international fora, but as you mentioned, these efforts are really not reflected at the national level, and as we have seen recently here in the Inter-American human rights system, Mexico has proved that it may change its attitude when it feels attacked. We have seen this reality played out in relation to the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights over the last year. Mexico was a great ally of the Commission until the group created by the Commission to investigate the Ayotzinapa case questioned the investigation carried out at the national level by governmental officials. Mexico got really upset and started to change its position in relation to the Commission. It suddenly became very critical, very outspoken and vocal about the need to make some changes to the Commission in order to improve its performance, in order to lower its politicization and raise its legitimacy. I'm not saying its critics were wrong, but it was very interesting to see that they started right after the tension escalated with the Ayotzinapa case. In relation to the ALBA countries, as you say in the report, there have been big defenders of national sovereignty. They are in general, against international scrutiny, and definitely not big fans of civil society. Venezuela and Cuba have been very straightforward on this, but as the report says, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua change or customize their positions depending on the international forum and the topic under discussion. I just want to mention as an example, as a very interesting example, in 2012, it was really amazing to see Ecuador here in the Inter-American system attacking the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and advocating for reducing the Commission's faculties, while at the same time, in the United Nations in Geneva, Ecuador was promoting a new binding treaty that would obligate corporations and make them liable for human rights violations. Somehow, Ecuador was like the human rights champion in the UN in Geneva. The same day that Ecuadorian NGO Pachamama was closed by government officials in Quito, Ecuador government was working mano a mano with civil society groups in Geneva to push for a resolution creating the working group to discuss this new treaty, which actually was a long-term goal of civil society worldwide. I was there. I was in Geneva that day, and I was really surprised to see that really in Geneva, Ecuador was considered like the human rights champion. But the exchange of information between CSOs here and CSOs in Europe was crucial in showing the inconsistency of the government's position and raising the political cost of closing the NGO Pachamama. About Brazil, I like the label enabler. I don't have time to go into the details, but we have seen this here in the system during the last years. The second point, about the level of cooperation with the Inter-American human rights system. The report includes an interesting assessment of the level of respect and commitment with the Inter-American Human Rights Commission of Human Rights from the perspective of the public hearings. I think it would be a very good idea to follow the patterns, but during a longer period, several years, and connect this information with other relevant data, such as the financial commitment, the level of compliance with the Commission and Court recommendations and decisions, but also with other criteria less analyzed, such as, for example, the profile of the candidates the states submit to the Commission and the Court. I think that the farthest the candidate is from the required profile to be a good member of the Commission and the Court, the less committed is that state with the strengthening of the system. And I will come back to this in a couple of minutes. Oh, in 1 minute. Finally, the third point, what could change in the region with the political shift in Latin America? I don't see big changes, neither to support or weaken human rights defense in international organs after the recent political changes. I am more concerned about the impact of the new administration here, but let's see. Argentina, for example, I guess it will maintain the status quo with a tendency to a less commitment. They won't necessarily attack the inter-American system, but I don't think they will engage actively in supporting it. I mean, it's a hypothesis. I just learned yesterday that Argentina submitted a candidate for the commission, a person who I don't know at all, but just, Googling and looking at the internet, I saw his CV, and it looks like he doesn't have any relevant experience on human rights. Well, this is the sign, no? This is a sign of the level of commitment with the system. Peru, although there are many progressive people in the Kuczynski administration, the majority of the Congress is from the Fujimori party, not particularly in favor of human rights. I don't expect any public display of affection between Kuczynski administration and the inter-American human rights system, but low-profile measures of support are possible, I think. Ecuador and Brazil, I don't know, difficult to say. Ecuador has elections soon, and even if the candidate of the official party won, it's very possible he will be less contentious than Rafael Correa. And we don't know about Brazil. They are very busy right now with their own business. To close, there are two upcoming events in the near future which we need to watch closely. The first one is the General Assembly in Mexico in June, where a badly needed financial support for the Commission and the Court will be discussed. So let's see what happens in June. And the second event will be the Summit of the Americas to be held in Lima in 2018 with the participation, we suppose, of Mr. Trump. We are looking forward to see what comes in both events and what the new dynamics in this very new political order are.
Very nice.
Thank you.
That's good.
Thank you very much, Katia. I think you have complemented excellently